Aha, third time lucky, third time lucky. So it's just 2 minutes before 7, so we're going live a little early, and hopefully people can hear me. Because I fiddled a lot and I discovered that um, there's a button just before you go live where you have to set your microphone despite the fact you've set it everywhere else. Anyway, let me just set my list of questions. 1 second. So it is Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock here in Ireland. The sun is starting to go down. It's almost the end of autumn. Another 2 weeks and it's winter, because in Ireland we begin winter very differently from the rest of the world. Um, but it's been a nice day. The weather has been reasonable. It's actually warm, and there's loads of insects about, which is funny. Anyway, so let us begin. Tonight, feel free to ask any questions if you want. Throw them into the chat. And I have a few here that I picked up. People send in various ways. And just to remind you that tomorrow I'll be doing the live stream with the two guys from Irish Medieval History and Clans and Dynasties. That'll be on at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And then Thursday I will have uh, a new video out. It's an interesting video. It is on William Marshall, Temple Church, Magna Carta, and Ireland. It's based on a visit I made to Temple Church in London, and I went thinking about, Da Vinci Code, all that sort of stuff, and I suddenly realized, hold on, everything in this church has got to do with Ireland, but they don't say it. So I hope you like the video. It's an interesting video. Just 1 second. People are starting to come on live, so say hello when you can, and let me know if you can hear me, because hopefully you can. Hopefully you can. Hopefully I've sorted out all those bugs in the hearing. The people are going up. There's a few people starting to log in, which is good, because I came on early just in case. So, the first question tonight, and if anyone listening wants to answer, throw an answer into the chat. Hi, Caveman. Hi, everyone. Can hear fine. Brilliant. Hi, Dennis. We can hear you. That's great. I was just saying I came on a little early, but there is a little button on YouTube just before you click go live where you have to reset your microphone, because even though I clicked on the setting one to default, this one to default, it clicks to some other one, and that's why no one can hear. It took me a lot of stress to find out that. So fingers crossed there will be no more gremlins tonight. Though it took me 3 goes to get in. For first 2 reasons it wouldn't work for some reason. So I was just saying, I'll just say it again, that uh, tomorrow night we'll have the live stream with the two guys, medieval Ireland, Irish medieval history and clans and dynasties, which will be 10 o'clock Irish time. We'll be talking about cattle raiding. Should be an interesting talk. And then on Thursday I will have a new long video out. It's on William Marshall, Temple Church, the Magna Carta, and Ireland. So it's a bit of it's the result of a visit to Temple Church and finding Irish history missing there when everything in Temple Church is related to Ireland. Okay, so let's move on. First question tonight is, what got you interested in Irish history? And I think my basic answer to that is everything. I've always been interested in Irish history since I was a kid. And I must say, I probably annoyed my history teachers when I was young by knowing too much history. And I remember I got a tour of the National Museum when I was, I think, 11 or 12 from my father's friend who worked very high up there. And he was very impressed with my knowledge of Irish history. Uh, Unfortunately, I live too far away from the museum to get a job there. I would love to have worked in the museum. But I've always been interested in history because I think if we don't understand history, if we don't know our history, if we misrepresent our history, then we won't understand the present. History is always something that's interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, new ideas, new research. You can never have a final version of history. You can never have a final book. It's very hard to produce a final book of history because someone is always going to do more research or research from a different way, use different ideas, more material turns up. So history is something that's, even though it's in the past, it's live. And the questions that historians ask change regularly. Um, like if you go back 50 years in time and take out history books on Irish history and European history, the books that we use in Irish schools, they'd be very different from what they're doing now. Because like my daughter is in the second year, so I was looking at her the junior cycle book. Um, there's so much of a stress in that on sources, on learning. I think it's trying to stimulate critical thinking. Whether it does or not, I'm not sure. But like it doesn't mention the 9 Years' War. It mentions very briefly a couple of lines, and it goes into big detail on the plantation of Ulster, and then jumps to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So, I find the approach a bit different, a bit funny to be honest, but things change. And if Irish history the same. I know in the late 70s and early 80s, people began to talk about revisionism, except revisionism became a curse word in some ways. But if you go back, if you look at Irish history in, say, the 50s or 60s, it was very patriotic history. And there was a swing against that, and then another swing. So it changes a lot. It changes a lot. Caveman, what's your favorite period of Irish history? I would say my favorite period definitely is the early modern, the 16th and 17th centuries, because it's a time when Ireland is changing. The English government is starting to push back into Ireland. You have attempts to change the church, to change religion from Catholic to Protestant, and then to start, inspired by Renaissance humanism. You have attempts to, bring in plantations, to destroy Gaelic Ireland. But at the same time, Gaelic Ireland is developing, is becoming stronger. So are some of the Old English lords. So you have various clashes, often unequal clashes. But in the 1590s, um, the Gaelic Ireland under Hugh O'Neill produces this confederacy, which is more than a match for the English soldiers, um, and defeated them several times. They basically lost because of Spanish and because English resources were so much more powerful. As after that, I like Iron Age and Bronze Age, especially the Bronze Age. It's something I actually want to dive much more into because I think if you look at the crafts that were produced, the craft work, whether the gold stuff or just go to Dublin Museum and look at this, look at spears, look at swords, look at bowls, um, look at wedge tombs and stuff like that. So much was produced, and we know so little about it. Wayne, you're asking, when do you think the Irish had the best living times? Um, in many ways, again, that comes down to how you mean by best living. But in many ways, if you look at the general data nowadays, because um, like my great grandparents had something like 18 kids. I don't really know for sure because several of them died very young. And I can find a list of 12 that survived. And they were not the poorest. So until the beginning of the 20th century, the amount of children who died as kids, as babies, the amount of women who would have died in childbirth would have been massive. Um, then if you were a soldier in the Napoleonic period, in the Cromwellian period, or before, more than likely you would die after going on campaign. Not so much from warfare, but from sickness. Um, People, like there was no defenses against sickness. Again, if you got a wound, you'd probably die. Um, Because if you look at the number of deaths versus wounded in the Napoleonic Wars, this is from military history, in World War One and World War Two, and nowadays the difference is staggering. So in many ways, people are the best off now. Um, Most people have roofs over their houses. Some unfortunates don't. Uh, Nearly everybody has enough food to eat. Some people may be poor, but the poverty nowadays is very, very different from before. But the way the world's going, God knows what will happen in 2 or 3 years. But I think uh, the best living times now. Though maybe if you jump back to go back 3,000 years, in some ways people would have had good living then because the population was small and there was a lot of land. So I presume there was less conflict. But again, I'm not sure. I think the best living is now. Caveman, Cashmore reinforced slide in the caves of Kesh, Iron Age slides. Oh, definitely. I would definitely enjoy them. Not Nishi. Yeah, I really want to go up to Mayo, Sligo, and then eventually Donegal and Tyrone. Well, basically everywhere. I would love to visit almost every Irish site. Um, there's so many I would like to, and that actually leads me on to the next question that I had as a kind of joke. If you could visit any historical site in Ireland right now, where would you go? And I'm not sure if I can give you one site. I can give you about 10. And Caveman, you've just given me one, two, three more that would be on that. I would actually love to visit within 1 week all the main kingship sites. So you have Tara, Cashel, Dunollinan in Leinster, Owenmacka in Ulster, and Rathcrogan in Connacht. They're all big places that were used. Some of them were used, like Tara was used until, say, the 10th century. But the others, they were important to the Gaelic Irish, but these places went back way before then. So, I think if I could visit those different places in a short period of time, you could kind of compare stuff. You have some very interesting things. Like Cashel, it is probably as old as the other ones, but we don't know that well because there's so much on top of it. The other places were abandoned and they weren't developed. So they're Iron Age / Gaelic sites as well as bronze, bronze age, etc. Cat, I had to reboot. I know the feeling. But we're going and it's working well. So what about anyone else? What sites would you like to visit? Another place I'd like to visit is Cornish. Okay, Caveman, Cornishin for Fermanagh, inauguration sites of McGuire King. Okay, another one on my long list. In going slightly northeast, I think it's Baymore in Tyrone. It is stone circles. It's hundreds of stones. It was under a bog, and they found it digging up the bog. So it's massive stone circles. I'd love to go there. I'd love to visit the 9 Years' War battlefields in Tyrone and Armagh, and also say Tyrconnell, Ulster, and a bit of Connacht, like the what's it called, the Curlew Pass, etc. I visited, thanks to Dennis, the Kinsale one more or less, and I visited near Loud. I made a video about it, Carlingford Lough. But I visited the big ones years ago on a tour, a specialized tour. I'd love to go back to them. Um, Now, another question. What period of Irish history deserves more documentaries, books, or people know more about it? Because some periods of Irish history, you can walk into a bookshop and find loads and loads and loads of stuff. Other periods you don't. Like 1916, the War of Independence, you'll find masses of books, especially recently. 1798, quite a good bit. Um, the 1640s reasonable, but like the 9 Years' War, you'll find 2 or 3 books. The Elizabethan period, 5 or 6. I think the Elizabethan period, there is a lot of good work done, but most of it's academic, so it's expensive. You can get them from the library, but they tend to disappear fairly quickly. And I think the period of the Elizabethan period, there's been huge advances made in knowledge, academic knowledge, and academic historiography of that period. But the public view is still quite out of date. Like people talk about Gráinne Mhaol, they talk about having fleets of ships, or her being a pirate queen. And then what they're talking about is sailing ships from the 18th century rather than galleys. So there's a lot of things wrong. Um, so I think that needs a lot of work done on. As other people, they have this picture of Gaelic Ireland as being something archaic, out of date, as not changing between St. Patrick and the Battle of Kinsale when it changed a lot. I think that idea needs to be massively, people need to understand that Gaelic Ireland was something that changed. Um, and Fermanagh connected, yeah, Fermanagh as well, connected with 9 Years' War, the Iron Battlefields, the castle, which has become a museum, I think it's a museum for some British regiment, Enniskillen Castle. And I think the last battle of the 9 Years' War was fought in Fermanagh at the very, very end between one of the Maguires and O'Sullivan Bear attacked and defeated English and one of the other Maguires there. It was near one of the lakes. I'd love to go to Fermanagh just to explore the lakes. Lochran, I've only seen pictures of it, but it looks so big and so magnificent. I'd like to go there. Just one sec. Okay, and then another. Who's your favorite McCarthy Branshaw member? I would say the McCarthys who used to own where I live, which were a tiny group of McCarthys. It was Slucht, Donald Rick. They had like 1/3 of Valencia and a few fields here and there. They were a tiny group, but because they used to own the land where I lived, I would say them. Not what you're expecting. But then I'll say after them, second will be the McAuliffe branch, just to keep you happy. And because I got that book, and I'm finding it very interesting. The one about the Duhallow. It's very well written and very, very interesting. So, and then I would say, I'm getting a blank now. The guy who won the Battle of Callan in 1261, which was an important battle. It's the Normans attacked into. They tried to reach Yverdon as such, and there was a fight going on between the McCarthy Moors. And the Normans were interfering on one side, and if you know Kerry, Kilgarvan, that's where what's his name? The TDs are what the TDs the Healy Rays are from. It's a little outside Kenmare, so it's kind of at the top of the Beara Peninsula. But if you just before you reach the town, if you turn right, you can eventually, and then you follow this very windy little road. Don't follow Google Maps because it will crash your car. And you'll come to a sign where the battle is supposed to have been fought. And there, McCarthy there, he defeated the Normans. He killed, I think it was the second Baron Baron Fitzgerald, who would eventually, then one of his descendants would become the Earl of Desmond eventually. The guy who won it, he was then killed attacking a castle a little outside Kinsale. The Normans inside had offered to surrender to him, but he didn't want. He kept attacking them, and then he got killed. And then his brother was killed near Mangerton Mountain. Mangerton Mountain is relatively near Killarney. If you are on the lakes, you can actually see the mountain. And somewhere up there, there's a road. I know Dennis has been there. I haven't. There's a road. I wouldn't even call it a road. There's a path that will bring you to. There's another sign of some sort, but that's where the battle is supposed to have been. It's an odd place for Normans to have been fighting because it's halfway up a mountain, and I think it's forested now, but it certainly would have been heavily forested 1,000 years ago or 900 years ago. So those are my most favorite McCarthy's. How about this one? What does Irish mythology tell us about the beliefs of people, of the old Irish people? Because, hi Kira, nice to see you on board. Irish mythology, we are very fortunate, or I would say Gaelic mythology, in having a very, very strong mythology that was preserved thanks to Christian monks, essentially. So we have managed to keep a series of stories, whether they're about Fionn McCule, whether about the Ulster cycle, Cuchulainn, etc., the King cycle, the Book of Invasions, and then like the whole Fianna one, which is huge. There's so much of it. There's so much of it. Many people try to say that like these stories go back to the Iron Age, go back to pre-Christian times, or go back to pre-Gaelic times. Some people insist that some of these stories are history. I've seen some people, because there's some reference in to the Tuatha Dé Danann arriving in ships in the air, and some people insist that these were like ancient aliens, which I just find hilarious. Some people seem to throw in ancient aliens everywhere, but God knows. I think what the myths point to us is what Gaelic people thought of at the time. It's because they were written down quite often, say in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, and then they were copied and written down and changed lots. So most of what we have would come from the 13th or the 14th century. And if you actually collate the versions, like going back to the Book of Invasions, going to the earliest version, which I think appears in a something written by a Welshman, the earliest we have, the Queen Scotia or Scota doesn't appear. So it's quite clear that this idea of coming from Egypt was a late addition. But the myths could point to what Gaelic people thought. The fact Queen Scotia, okay, someone believed that it was important to put some sort of classical biblical account to make the Irish people come from the Bible, because they obviously read the story of Moses and changed it a little and put it in. Hi, Kat. What do you mean by that show is hilarious? There was some show about Irish mythology that I missed. Should I watch it? The Cuchulainn stories in particular, some people think that they are the oldest myths, that they go back much further. And I know that if you go into, how should we say it politely, a rather controversial belief some people in Northern Ireland, like Protestants or Loyalists, they're very attached to the idea that Cuchulainn was a real figure who was under the Cruithne, who fought against the Gaelic Irish. Ancient Aliens. I've never actually seen Ancient Aliens. I just hear people referring to it, and then when you look online, Facebook just it shows bizarre things, and I see so much stuff. People talking about aliens in Egypt, etc., etc. I don't know why it thinks I like that stuff, but so this this belief is that the Cruithne, who, as far as I know, they think that they were forced out of Ireland and went to Scotland, and then that they came back in the plantation of Ulster. They use Cuchulainn a lot. I know in the 1980s and 1990s, in parts of East Belfast, which is the very Protestant part, there were a couple of murals of Cuchulainn. And it's just funny because the picture they used was a copy, essentially, of the famous statue of Cuchulainn that is in the GPO. It's him dying tied to the post, and it was put in the GPO, because of the idea of peers, etc., of sacrificing themselves. So these loyalists, they took this image and they began to use it themselves. And there's still a few books, and there's actually someone on Instagram advocating that. I see his stuff occasionally, so that I don't really engage with it because I don't like that sort of fight. But there is a guy, I've shown you one of his books, Origins of the Irish, and I just can't remember his name now, but he has written a very interesting book called The Irish Dreamtime, where he goes through all these myths, all these stories, and his knowledge of them is amazing. And he tries to put them against history. And he looks at references, say, for example, to chariots, to a wheel, to types of weapons, to types of technology, and tries to date them. And also looking at timelines that you can get from Irish stories. J.P. Mallory, thank you, Kat. That's exactly him. So his book is very, very interesting. And he basically says that these stories, in the end, they give us a view into the beliefs and the world of the people who wrote them, rather than going way, 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 way back. I have a feeling maybe Cuchulainn goes back further. There's some very interesting stuff, like there is a story, I did a video on this. It's at the Battle of Ventry, Cot Countraw. And if you actually read it, there's a version out that you can buy that's bilingual in modern Irish. I can read modern Irish reasonably. Old Irish I can't read. It's very, very hard. But reading this book, you can see that whoever wrote it knew Dingle and they knew South Kerry, because there's essentially a fleet belonging to the King of the World coming to invade Ireland, and they're being guided by an Irish guy, and the first place they stop is the Skelligs, and then they're complaining about there being no beach, and then the guy brings it to Ventry, and then there's other discussions. You can see, like, I can see all of that outside my window, because my window has a very privileged view of the Blaskets and the Skelligs. So you can see that whoever wrote this story was from the area, and he really, really knew it. And like in other Fianna ones, there's a lot of Fianna stuff, people forget about it. In Kerry, if you know Dermot agus Grania, the Tordock, as it's called, the flight of Dermot and Grania, Dermot is from this area. And outside Glenbeigh, there's Seafin Mountain, where John McEwl is supposed to have spied on them. And then everybody knows Tierna Nog, but nobody knows that Niamh appeared to Oisin on Ross Bay Beach, which is where my mother grew up, which I find interesting. And then if you're in this part of Kerry, and say the main way of Kerry Road is closed, the only way to get to Killarney or Killorgan is to go across the Balloch. The Balloch is short for Balloch Oisin, the Pass of Oisin. So the name of it goes back to the Fianna legends. I don't know how old that name is, but it's a very, very interesting thing. So I think mythology, I love Irish mythology. I don't like when people abuse it or people say all this mad stuff about it, but I think it's fascinating. I think it's very complex, and because there's loads of different versions, and I wish more people would go to the original rather than take on third, fourth translations of translations of translations, and they lose the context. The context is very, very important. Okay. Um, Another question I was asked: do you think we should protect uh, Irish historical sites more strongly? Um, the easy answer to that is yes. The hard answer is how. Because there are so many sites. Like if you think of Ringfort, Ringfort is probably the most common historical site in Ireland, and they reckon there's 40,000 of them. So that's a lot of stuff. How do you protect something like that? Near me here, in 1 kilometer, if I go northwards, I'm going to fall over some Iron Age or Bronze Age walls. If I go in another direction, there's an Olm stone that you can't actually read anymore because of cows. There's another Olm stone nearby in the middle of a monastic settlement, which is also used as a killeen. And then above that, there's a wedge tomb. And that's just within, and there's actually some other stuff as well. How would you protect all that? At the other end of Valencia, from where I live, in Bray Head, there were 3 standing stones in a row. One of them fell down about 5 years ago. I reported it. The OPW have still not come to have a look at it. It's just so much stuff. How do you do it? How do you protect it? Some sites like Skellig Michael is heavily protected. Some of the ring forts are heavily protected, but most is on private land and they're in private ownership. Nowadays, fortunately, people and farmers or builders damage them less. Though I know that there is a stone circle a little outside Killarney, which is kind of fenced off at the moment. But I know the guy tried to get planning permission to build houses around it, but he wasn't granted that. And I know that there's a danger of plowing over ring forts, and several have been. Um, there is protection, there's quite good protection, but the punishments for breaking it, for being, if you want to be bad, you can be bad and get away with it, which I think is something you find everywhere in the world. Um, do I know of the history of the crossing from Calnafersie to Latricallo, Kevin? I presume you mean from Calnafersie, which is near Killorglin, to somewhere on the other side. That I don't. It's a very interesting area. That's where in 1916, the, was it 4 guys they drowned? They were to steal a radio to contact a German ship. It was night and they took a wrong turn. And instead of getting the main road, they got this road which drove down to a pier. And they didn't realize it and they pressed brakes and they went into the river and drowned. I don't know much about the crossing there. I know my daughter rows down there, so it's quite wide. Kat, do they have strict laws for historical preservation? They have strict laws. So, like, if you obey the laws, stuff is protected mostly. But, like, for example, there are controversies. Like about 20 years ago, there was a plan to build a motorway through near Tara, and there was a lot of controversy because there is so much stuff in that part of Ireland. Because you have Tara, not so far away, you have Newgrange, Doubt, you have Trim Castle, you have more Yeah, like you have an amazing amount of stuff. The problem there in that area as well, the farmland is very good, so it's been used as farms for a long time. So a lot of stuff has been plowed over. But as Anthony Murphy shows, when it's very, very dry, and you use a drone, you can find a lot of stuff. Like Anthony Murphy, I think about 4 years ago, he found, or maybe it was more, drone henge. He found the marks in a field of um, a huge henge. So there's, if you're good, stuff is preserved. But there are farmers who've plowed over, who've knocked down um, not buildings. They've knocked down standing stones. They've knocked down wedge tombs, and sometimes they may get fined. Sometimes they get away with. They say sorry, and then like a lot of stuff would have been lost in the 19th century. In Ventry, there's a girls' school. I think it's called Navita, and if you go there, it's like it was Lord Ventry's house. The driveway down there is full of Ogham stones. I've only seen pictures of it. So Lord Ventry went around collecting Ogham stones and putting them in his garden. You'll find the same in UCC, University College Cork. There is like this very old building, I think it's called the Aula Maxima, and it has this lovely corridor inside just with Ogham stones. I think there's like 30 Ogham stones there. They're all well protected and they're in good condition, but I'm not sure of how they were collected. And then, like when I to the Mace Castle, I think the grandfather of Charles Stewart Parnell owned it for a while, and he tried to rebuild it. And lots of other castles got rebuilt or knocked down in the 19th century. So a lot of stuff was done then that we've lost, or it happened all over Europe. You had nice old castles, and then Lord such and such comes along and he tries to make them into Disney castles, uh, which most which is questionable. Like most Irish castle hotels are really big. Um, they're big mansions that were built where they either ignored the castles or knocked them down and built something in the 19th century. If you go to Glynn and Limerick and you look for Glynn Castle, you've discovered this big mansion. You have to go into the town itself and look for the castle that was the site of the Knights of Glynn until the 17th century. All that's left is a tower house, but that's the ancient castle. The other place is a posh one. So there are strict laws, but people can get away with it. Uh, do you think the strict rules on metal detecting here in Ireland are good? I do. I think you have to be conservative about that. Maybe they could open them slightly, but the problem is if you walk around with a metal detector and you dig stuff up, a lot of people won't hand it in. And then when you dig it up, you will destroy something. Because when you do an archaeological dig, you're going to destroy something. Um, the the German guy who found Troy, apparently he destroyed an astronomical amount of stuff. I think he used dynamite in some places. So he found this city, and like the city is ancient, so there's I don't know how many cities were there until he got to the period he was interested in. So he just ignored that. He threw out most of what was there and went to find this stuff. So when you dig, you destroy. That's why nowadays archaeologists LIDAR for them is something groundbreaking, where that you can get a brilliant view of what's under the ground without digging. They've used that a lot in Tara, and they found like in Tara you have the central Furrow, which is the central part near Cormac, and then you have a very large circle going around that Rathmarie, the Wrath of the Kings. But then they discovered this huge henge going around that, which is before the Rathmarie was built, and they've discovered there were posts, wooden posts put in there. I think they may have been burnt down occasionally, so it was something huge. But they found out without digging. So I think like the problem with metal detecting, people in England find a lot of stuff. Most of them, a lot is handed in. I know that there was a case where some people found a big hoard of treasure. I think it was Anglo-Saxon treasure, and they tried to sell it and got caught and ended up in jail. But you know, if if you can find something interesting, but maybe you can by accident ignore other stuff and stuff that's not metal. What happens with that? You're looking for you want to find something metal. You want to find a sword or something, but you ignore the buttons, you ignore stone tools, whatever. Yeah, Kat, you're right. They can use geophysical machines. They can use a lot of stuff now. They can use a lot of stuff. I think you'll notice now that they'll go into an area and they kind of dig a couple of test trenches and then cover them back up again. I know that in Glendalough, they have a very interesting ongoing experiment. It's like where they get local people and not so local to help do with their digs. And like I think this year they were digging in Glendalough, but they're not particularly interested in the monastic period. Where they're digging is near where the mining went on. So that's they were trying to find out about the mining part, which would be more say 18th, 19th century. And again, they dig one or two trenches, and then they move on to something else, and then they cover it back up. Okay. Another question. Sorry, I just have a sip of tea first. Was St. Patrick as important as his legend, as his mythos? That's a hard one. Oh, sorry, Wayne, you asked something first. I'll come back to St. Patrick. Do you think the Britons of the Bronze and Iron Ages before the Romans turned up had much in common with the Irish of the time? Um, hmm, Good question, Wayne. I'd say yes and no, because it seems to become in the from the work they've been doing on ancient DNA, which changes a lot. It seems that people came into Ireland through Britain, and then it's very possible that I think the Beaker culture perhaps could have started on some of the Scottish islands and then come down through Scotland and Ireland. Um, and at that stage, you have to think of the sea, especially the Irish Sea, not as a blockage. Nowadays, we look at the sea as something that blocks. Then it was very much a highway. People could travel up and down the sea, um, from Europe to England, from Europe to Ireland, etc., between England and Ireland, around the coast of Ireland. Um, Especially, for example, say in the Bronze and Iron Age, when there weren't many roads in Ireland. There were some roads, and they're finding more and more. That one of the problems with these ancient roads in Ireland is that trees were cut down and then the bog swallowed everything up, which is good because it preserves the road, but it's all buried. So it was easier to move around Ireland by boat, by ship. For example, one of the reasons Brian Boru did so well is he had the Limerick Vikings. The Limerick Vikings had good ships, and they were able to bring him up and down the Shannon. He'd go up the Shannon and attack Meath very easily, attack Ulster relatively easy. So, because the Shannon is a very important highway, it brings you right through the northern part of Ireland. Um, if you had a boat, you could go like um, the galleys that the Scots, the Lords of the Isles would use, and then some of the Irish groups used in along the west coast. You can go from the north, say from Rathlin Island down to the Shannon quite quickly and quite safely, and you can bring stuff, and then you can go on to England, to Spain, wherever. Um, in the Iron Age, I think there may have been more of a separation, especially in the Christian period. Because in Britain they seem to be rewriting quite a bit of the pre-Roman period, like 100 years before, because you have interesting developments in Gaul, let's say culminating, Vercingetorix, where you have this big confederacy of the Gaulish warriors, where the amount of numbers involved, okay, they're exaggerated in the sources, but you had armies of probably tens of thousands, you have groups moving around. So there was a lot of trade and a lot of movement between parts of what's now France and England, what's now England. So you had things changing in England. There would have been constant interaction between England and Ireland as well, or between Britain, Roman Britain and Ireland, pre-Roman and Britain. So they would have had quite a bit in common, but there would have been differences. One thing, Ronald Hutton, he's written a history of pagan Britain. He covers Ireland as well in it. And if you look at his stuff for pre-Roman Britain and the early part of Roman Britain, what impressed me was the amount of gods people were worshipping. Or because the Romans had loads and loads of gods. It looks like the Britons had lots of gods because they dig up statues and they kind of work out the name of the god or goddess, and the number of these is multiplying. So it's probably the same in Ireland. So you probably had things that were very unifying, but then you had a lot of localism. Like in Ireland now, there is a multitude of saints. There's a multitude of holy wells. I have a feeling that in the pre-Christian period, like each county, wasn't a barony, which sometimes like a third or a quarter of a county, they would have had their own religious groups, their own holy wells as such, their own rituals. Crumb was important in some parts, and in other parts he wasn't. So you would have had some differences and some similarities. The same with most history. Okay, Dennis, you're asking about the 9 Years' War. Just let me take another sip of my tea. What were the main reasons why Irish clans didn't side with Hugh O'Neill in the 9 Years' War? Basically, it was either fear of him, or fear of the crown. In Gaelic Ireland at that time, you're very welcome, Wayne. So if you're a lord, with a few exceptions, if you say you're McCarthy, Butler, Desmond, or O'Neill, and perhaps O'Donnell and O'Brien, if you were a normal lord, you normally had a more senior lord, who you'd have to pay tax to. Tax could be money, tax could be cows, tax could be soldiers, tax could be anything really. And if you say, for example, O'Connor Sligo, O'Donnell was putting pressure on O'Connell Sligo, and he was saying, because Reggie O'Donnell in particular, he was very successful at controlling a lot of the north of Connacht, Sligo and Mayo. And so O'Connor Sligo, he's a bit annoyed with this. And then he kind of says, hold on a second, there's this person called the Queen, and then the British state, the English state. Maybe if I be nice to them, they'll keep O'Donnell away, which happened a bit, but then it would have other things that suddenly you have a much bigger British state, and you want to get rid of that, but you can't. So a lot of people, they were looking for a counterbalance. They wanted as much de facto autonomy or independence as possible. Other ones, it was the traditional inheritance in Gaelic Ireland was not primogeniture, so it could lead to a lot of jumping around, a lot of fights, a lot of civil wars. So several lords, they wanted their eldest son to inherit, so that's why they would support the English. Others, they were just frightened. Um, like Hugh O'Neill is in Dungannon. Below him was the O'Neills of the Fews, a separate branch, kind of South Armagh. Uh, and the O'Neills of the Fews had a complicated relationship with the O'Neills of Dungannon. They didn't like it when the O'Neills of Dungannon were too powerful. And then the O'Neills of the Fews were much nearer Dundalk and the other Tynecastle, the other British English garrisons. So they would suffer. So sometimes, like in 1600, Mountjoy forced them to surrender and to go over. Uh, and then a lot of people, they would just, if Hugh O'Neill was marching by with his army, they'd say, yeah, we support you. And then they would jump back. Others, like the McCarthy of Muskerry, he stayed loyal to the English crown, but his brother was with O'Neill. They would kind of do both ways. The same actually happened, I'm fairly sure, with some of the Scottish clans in the 45s in Scotland. The Lord might stay loyal to the British crown or might go to Bonnie Prince Charlie, whereas his son would go on the opposite. So they would try and ensure that the land wouldn't be confiscated, because the English crown had the option of confiscating land and giving it to someone else, which happened a lot. And that scared many people. Though at the same time, you also had a problem which got much worse in the 17th century. You had people like the Carews. The Carews' great 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 grandfathers came over with the Normans and were given land by Henry II. And then they got driven out of Ireland and they forgot about it. And you had various other Irish lords and groups living on their land. And then these guys come back in the 16th century and say, that's our land. And they go to court, and the English judge says, of course it's your land. And then they go along with soldiers and they say, this is our land now, which creates a lot of problems, like in Munster. And then in the 17th century, like in Connacht, in Ulster, in many places that happens. So it was very destabilizing of the political situation. Yeah, I think those are the basic reasons. It's basically politics. People were trying to survive as best they could. Most of them, even someone like Niall Garve O'Donnell, who um, who was he was the cousin of Hugh O'Donnell, Reggie O'Donnell. His grandfather, I think, was O'Donnell before. He wants to become O'Donnell, and once the English force lands in Lough which is Derry, he has an opportunity to go over, and he goes over to the English side. But if you look at his demands, they include exactly what Hugh O'Neill is asking for. He wants to enjoy power over Tyrconnell. He wants to be able to appoint the sheriff there, though he says he'll appoint a nice person. He also is demanding religious freedom. And then the English promise him everything. And then Neil Garve is very important in the English recapturing most of Tyrconnell. The big battle in Donegal town itself. In the end, Neil Garve is besieged in the monastery in Donegal, and Hugh O'Donnell only lifts that siege when he goes south to Kinsale. However, Neil Garve the English did a fast one on him. At the end of the war, Mountjoy and then King James said, no, we'll appoint Hugh O'Donnell's brother Rory as Earl of Tyrconnell. And then I think it was in 1607 when you had that mad uprising near Derry. Although Neil Garve was in prison in Dublin, they blamed on him, and he gets sent to the Tower of London for life. So it was a complicated thing. Davy, or the Gaelic lords side with the Gaelic order over the crown. After the Yellow Fort, yes, because the Yellow Fort is a massive victory. Suddenly the English have no army. Hugh O'Neill, he sends a raiding party under Tyrrell, his illegitimate son, and Rory O'Moore, and they go from into Tipperary and then into Limerick, and basically they don't even have, from the numbers, they almost have no horses. It's just a group of men, lightly armed men, walking along, and the entire British, the entire English population who've been put there in the plantation of Ulster run. It's amazing what happens. They all run for Cork. A few take refuge in castles. There are some massacres, but probably not many. And then you have people like perhaps Spencer writing. There's some books or stuff written, and it's all very, very puritanical stuff, saying that the reason why the Gaelic Irish had won at that stage was because of God being annoyed with them. Nothing that they were cowards and they'd fled. And then a lot of the lords would come over. If you look at North Kerry and Limerick, like the O'Connor Kerry was a strong supporter of O'Neill, so was the Knight of Glyn, so was Fitzmaurice, whereas many of the Gaelic lords in the Midlands weren't, in part because they were influenced by Ormond. If they were too pro-O'Neill, Ormond would raid them. So it was a difficult situation. It was a difficult situation for them. Now, let me go back to St. Patrick. Was St. Patrick as important, or legend says, or is that just later myth? The answer is really both, because there's a huge amount of myth about St. Patrick. Most of the stuff that people say around St. Patrick's Day is myth. The driving out the snakes is really, really, really. No, Davey, that was fine. That was fine. That was fine. I like when people chat and ask questions. It helps me a lot. So most of the stuff about St. Patrick, anything you see about St. Patrick fighting druids, driving the snakes, that's all myth. The snakes perhaps is as late as the Norman invasion. Giraldus Cambrensis is one of the first to put it into books. A lot of the other stuff, especially fighting the Druids, comes about 200, 250 years later, when there is a bit of a fight going on in the church. So if you, like me, grew up going to Irish Catholic school, etc., you kind of have this belief that Armagh has always been the main Catholic base in Ireland, because it's where the cardinal or the primate is. But St. Patrick comes in 432, and about 200 years later, you have several Christian centres, and you have two main ones: Kildare based on Bridget, and Armagh based on Patrick, and they're both trying to become most important. And so the Armagh side is very successful at producing a lot of works about St. Patrick, in which you see the stuff about him fighting the Druids, etc. In part, that's because they're just echoing stories about Christian martyrs in Rome. So they're trying to make Patrick into an even more heroic figure. There is similar stuff, but less has survived about St. Bridget. Armagh was more important, was more successful. Perhaps it was only more successful because of Brian Boru, because after he becomes king, he gives a lot of money to Armagh. Do I have a feeling that Armagh had established his primacy before? But both, if you go back to the figure of St. Patrick and the figure of Bridget, they're both very interesting and very important figures in the establishment of Christianity. St. Bridget is a bit more interesting in that she's from Ireland. She's a woman who I think was the daughter of a slave or something like that. And though she should have some royal connections, and she manages to establish this monastery that becomes very important. And there is a story, I don't know the full details of it, where she seems to have given one of the people with her, one of her entourage, a woman, seems to have become pregnant, and St. Bridget managed to make the pregnancy disappear, uh, which some people say she gave her abortion, other people know. A lot of people just don't talk about it. I don't know that what the original Irish for that is, but it's quite interesting. So, but like St. Patrick, St. Bridget, and the other early people who set up the church in Ireland are very important because they come in and they establish a church which grows. It probably takes an extra century, another century longer than most people think to grow. There doesn't seem to have been organized resistance. Um, Probably because I think the Gaelic religion, pre-Christian religion, was very decentralized. There wasn't a Druidic church itself. There may have been Druids, but there wasn't an organized church, so they were able to spread. But I'd say it took 200 years or more before all of Ireland became Christian. But even looking at that, there's no doubt that Patrick and others, and Bridget especially, they did something very powerful in a way. Whatever, leaving aside what your opinions about religion at the moment, in terms of a historical impact, Patrick, Bridget, and whoever the Christians who were in Ireland beforehand. Um, yeah, St. Patrick made a fire. If you go to Tara, the next hill over, is it Ishnock? No, it has another name. There was supposed to be a fire there where the High King was burning a fire, and St. Patrick made his own fire. He's only supposed to. Again, that is a much later invention. That story is a much later invention. Um, if you look at St. Patrick's own work, they're very, very interesting. And they actually tell you a lot about that period, about Gaelic Ireland in, say, the early 5th century, and about some of his difficulties converting people. I think no one bothered to punish him because they didn't think he was doing anything particularly wrong. There didn't seem to have been a big religious fight. Just St. Patrick went about trying to convert people. And I think you can probably say it's true that there was a reasonable amount of Christians there before him. But perhaps we'll return to that another day. Okay, so it's 8 o'clock. I've been going for just over an hour. So I'm going to say good night. We made it through without any interruptions for a change. So I hope you all made it. Just to finish, I'll have another live stream tomorrow at 10 with Irish medieval history and clans and dynasties. And then on Thursday, I will have a video coming out on William Marshall Temple Church in Ireland. And then I'll be back here with this next Tuesday. So I'll see you all then. Sloan, thanks a million for coming in. Thanks for the questions. And feel free to ask me any questions in between. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye, Kat. Bye, Davey. Bye, everyone else. Bye-bye.